thank you, Anthony, for taking time out of your very busy day to talk with me and here at the Black Experience. And it's an absolute honor and privilege to get a chance to talk to you about your amazing life. So what I'd like to do, if it's okay, Anthony, is I'd like to start with talking about people's, their foundations, their families, their parents, grandparents, influences, champions, mentors, and things of that sort. So, where you grew up and, the role and influence of your parents and grandparents. Could we start there?
Sure. Well, so I grew up in between two places. My mother was from England and my father was from Ghana. And I was born in London, but I went to Ghana when I was about 1 year old.
Okay.
So I don't really remember that. And that my father was a law student when I was born, so he was finishing up. And then we went home, and about a year and a half after me, my elder sister was born, and I have two younger sisters as well. And so from then on, my English grandmother visited us in Ghana from time to time, but I didn't really spend much time in England until I was about 8 again.
Okay.
And then I spent a fair amount of time in England after the age of 8, because when I was 8, my father was a political prisoner. He was locked up by Dr. Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, and
yes,
I was not very well. So my mother, who had plenty of things to worry about as the wife of a political prisoner, with young children, sent me off to my English grandmother, who, as I say, I knew because she visited us in Ghana. And she put me in a school near where she lived. And so from then on, I was in English boarding schools as a child, and went home for the vacations, basically, and until I went to university. So from the age of 8, I was in England during the school term, and in Ghana usually during the vacation. Some vacations, like a short vacation, Easter vacation, I sometimes didn't go to Ghana, but I always went for the summer, and unless my mother came to England, in which case we stayed in England. So we went back and forth between the two. And I calculated at one point that I'd spent equal numbers of months in Ghana and England on my 21st birthday. So I'd spent more or less literally half time in each.
All right. Well, no, there's a lot to unpack there, Anthony. So tell me, all right, so because you were born in the mid-50s, correct?
Born in 1954, yeah.
Okay, 54. So tell me, this is fascinating. Now, your father's Ghanaian, your mother is English. What year did they marry?
53.
53.
The year before I was born.
And that wasn't that common, was it?
No, it wasn't. In fact, people sometimes say it was the first black-white society wedding in England, because my father's family was associated with the royal family of Asante. My grandfather, his father, was in effect the sort of prime minister of the King of Ashanti, but also his brother-in-law. And so the King of Asante was my father's uncle by marriage. And he himself came from a line of chiefs in Asante, and he ended up being head of the family and owning the land that went with that. With that, and my mother's father had recently died when they got to know each other, but he had been Chancellor of the Exchequer, a member of the cabinet, and in the Labour cabinet after the war. He'd been leader of the House of Commons in Churchill's cabinet. He'd been ambassador to Moscow during the war and so on. And his father was also a politician. He was the Labour leader of the House of Lords. So they were a sort of public family. Yes. And so when so when their wedding was announced, when their engagement was announced, it was big news. In fact, they had a press conference to announce their engagement, and my mother came to it from one of the coronation cocktail parties at Buckingham Palace, because she'd been invited to that. So anyway, so it was a big deal, and it got, the wedding, it got good coverage in places like Ebony, because they were interested in such things, and it got good coverage, very wide coverage in the British press and the Ghanaian press. And so I like to tell people that I was and so because of that, my own birth was also covered in Ebony and the Ghanaian newspapers and the London Times and so on. And I like to tell people that I was born famous, and I've been getting less famous ever since, because of my parents' background, these political families. And it was unusual. The guy who wrote Guess Who's Coming to Dinner said that there were a couple of couples that he thought about when he was writing that play, but my parents was one of them. And it was a big deal, as I say, because this was the marriage of two members of sort of the governing classes of Britain and one of its colonies, which was going to be independent very soon, of course. Yes. Because in 1957 we became independent, and my father was in the Independence Parliament, elected to Parliament.
That's fascinating, and I'm gonna have to pick your brain about it. I'm a World War II, I don't know what the right word is, enthusiast, historian. And so if your grandfather, you're saying, was the ambassador from England to Moscow.
Yes, so he was the guy whose job was to persuade Stalin that it would be a bad mistake to join with the Germans. And when the Russian alliance with the Allies was organized, he went back to London, and became leader of the House of Commons, which is a sort of cabinet post under Churchill. So
he must have some. I don't know whether he shared them, but he must have had some great stories about Stalin and great stories about Churchill.
Well, one of my he didn't get on with Churchill very well. Churchill, my grandfather was, among other things, very religious. He was a member of the lay synod of the Church of England. I think he was the first layman to preach in St. Paul's Cathedral, and he wrote a book. He wrote a book called God in Our Work, and so on. And so he was, from Churchill's point of view, too pious. So Churchill once said about my grandfather, "There, but for the grace of God goes God," because he was also famously clever. My grandfather was at one point, I think, the highest paid lawyer in England. He was a very, very clever lawyer. He'd been actually a chemistry student as an undergraduate, and he had published a paper in the Journal of the Royal Society while he was an undergraduate. So he was very smart and famously smart, and also a little bit pious. And Churchill was a man who liked to drink and make jokes about sex and so on. And I don't think my grandfather was humorless, but he was not like that. And also, there was a period after the return from Moscow when my grandfather was thought of as a possible replacement for Churchill. So he was a competitor. But my grandfather wasn't very good at that kind of politics. He wasn't very good at the kind of politics that gets you to the top.
Two things. What was it? What was his name, Anthony?
His name was Sir Stafford Cripps, and he. His highest post, as I say, was Chancellor of the Exchequer. So he was the finance minister in the Labour government after the Second World War that created the welfare state. And so it was he who had to figure out the financing of the National Health Service, and he who had to also to deal with the difficulties that, though Britain had won the war, it had huge debts, and so rationing had to continue even though the war was over, and that was his responsibility to explain to people why that was. And as you can imagine, it wasn't very popular. But
Did he learn? Did he live long enough for you to know him very well?
No, he died about the time my parents met. Actually, he died. He got cancer, and so I never met him. My mother was obviously very shaped by him and talked about him, and because my mother was in Moscow with him, actually.
Really? Oh, okay.
And she had to be evacuated when the Germans invaded Moscow. She had to go out of Russia through Persia.
Wow.
And,
okay.
She spent some time working in Persia as the secretary of the man who ran the British officer who was running the Persian railroad in order to move wartime goods around. So she had an interesting life. She was very young when that happened, and then not long after the war, when my grandfather was Chancellor of the Exchequer, my grandmother, as the wives of politicians often do, headed up a fundraising campaign to raise money for people who were starving in China, because during the civil war between the Kuomintang and the communists, there was a lot of food shortages, and so this was not political. They actually divided the money between the two sides and spent it feeding people on both sides. And so my grandmother and my mother stayed with Chiang Kai-shek, and then they went and stayed with Mao for a couple of days in order to see the distribution of these goods. So it was in other words, it was meant to be entirely philanthropic. It wasn't meant in any way to intervene in the war in China.
Yeah, well, those are two big personalities and two very different personalities, and Mao and Chiang Kai-shek. That must have been fascinating.
Yes, I think my grandmother, the person my grandmother admired, I think, was actually Zhou Enlai. I think she found him. I don't know that she liked Mao very much, but she had a soft spot for Zhou Enlai. And my grandfather was an interesting character, because he was raised. His father was a Conservative member of Parliament when he was young, but he ended up being in the first Labour government, and the whole family basically moved left. And so my great grandfather was also in the first Labour government, even though he had been a Conservative member of Parliament, and as was my great uncle Sidney. So the first Labour cabinet was sort of a family affair. So they were socialists, but he was also sort of anti-imperialist, even though he was a cabinet minister in the British imperial cabinet. So he was involved, for example, in the creation of the Jamaican Labour Party. He spent some time in Jamaica.
Really?
And he was pretty close to Nehru as well, and interested in Indian independence. My mother played with Indira Gandhi as a child, because while she was in England, she came to stay with my grandparents because they were friends of her father's. And so my mother grew up in a world of not just an English world, but a very international world with lots of close friends who were not British. And I think that makes it less surprising that she had that she was perfectly happy when she decided my father was the right guy, she didn't think there was much of a problem.
Yeah, Anthony, let me ask you this. Did your mother or someone written a book about your mother?
No, they haven't. I mean, she wrote a longish autobiographical essay for a volume of essays, autobiographical essays by writers, because in the end, she was a children's writer and then a novelist. And so she did write a bit about her own life. So that's, I don't know, 30, 40 pages. My father wrote a full autobiography, which is called Joe Appiah, the Autobiography of an African Patriot. And it's very interesting.
Yeah, I'd love to find a copy.
I can get you one.
Yeah.
So she was, and my grandmother's was when she told, because my grandfather was dying, so she didn't get to talk to him about this. But when she talked to my grandmother, all my grandmother said was, "Well, shouldn't you go to the Gold Coast to see what it's like before you decide if you want to live there?" So my mother went to Ghana, to the Gold Coast as it then was, on her own.
on her own.
On her own, just to see. And of course, this was this topic of much speculation, because nobody could understand why the daughter of a recently deceased British cabinet minister was traveling around Ghana with the associates of Kwame Nkrumah, who was busy trying to kick the British out of the Gold Coast.
And what year was this, Anthony?
So this must have been 51 or so, something like that. Okay. And she had a great time. She got on very well with my father's family, and they gave their approval. And so she came home and said to her mother, "Well, that's not going to be a problem." And then her mother said, "Well, why did you go ahead then?" So it wasn't very. And it's complicated. British racism is complicated. I suppose all racism is complicated. And there were racist reactions. I mean, we have copies of letters written to my mother particularly by white women from the British colonies, accusing her of, race treason and all that kind of thing. And but in my mother's family, only one of her uncles really didn't approve. And you'll not be surprised to hear that he was the one who emigrated to South Africa, and where he felt happier, apparently.
Well, no, I want to get back to how your parents met, but since you're talking about this, and I was going to ask about the racism. I mean, you have the fall of the British Empire. I mean, you mentioned a couple of instances. In retrospect and listening to your parents, what effect do you think some of this negativity, this racism had on them, Anthony?
I think, I mean, at least the way my mother responded, talked about it, she just thought it was either funny or sad. I don't think, it certainly didn't put them off. I mean, it certainly didn't discourage them. And, I've always felt that racism came at our family in a very odd way, because we did belong to in the countries we grew up in, we belonged to the sort of ruling elites. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the things that racism does to people, you can be protected from by class to some extent.
Okay.
And so it didn't make sense really for people in my English boarding school to look down on me, because, my grandmother was coming to give the speech day talk. And so in Ghana, people are obviously everywhere are curious about people who don't look like everybody else. And we were lighter skinned, obviously, than typical Ghanaians. But I wouldn't have said there was any hostility on the grounds of that. It was just curiosity. And, in Kumasi, our hometown, which is the second town in Ghana, the curiosity didn't last very long because, because my uncle was the king, my great uncle was the king, and then he was actually succeeded by my uncle. So, everybody knew who we were, so they knew why we looked different, because they knew about my mother. And my mother was an important person in town. She was involved in the way that the wives of politicians often are, with orphanages and old people's homes and getting children adopted and working with lepers and doing all the things, all the good works that you do. She was a very devout, both of my parents were very devout Christians. As I said, my grandfather was too. And my grandmother, actually both my grandfathers, my father's father was not only the brother-in-law of the king and his prime minister, but he was also an elder of the Methodist Church. So they were all very much involved in good works and well known. My father was a very well known person in our town. So people, if you'd sort of been wandering around and a different color from other people, and nobody knew who you were, that was one thing. But since everybody did know who you were, it really didn't figure very much. And we spoke my father's language, obviously, as well as English, and so we could talk to people, and they could talk to us. So I don't think, and in England, I was either at school, which is a regulated environment, and if anybody had been overtly racist at school, they would have been punished. Or we were in my grandmother's village or my uncle's village, and again, everybody knew who everybody was. Yes. My grandmother and my aunt Teresa lived next door to each other in the village that I spent most of my time in, and my uncle John, Sir John Cripps, was had the big farm in the village where my mother grew up, which we spent time in as well, and was many people in that village were his tenants, so they knew about, and I can still go there now 50 years later, and people know who we are. So even though nobody I have a cousin who lives there, but most of the family's left. So I don't feel that we suffered very much as a result of this. And as I say, my parents' view was that it was the problem. It was the racist problem. It wasn't their problem. Yeah.
So you mentioned your mother's reaction and sort of in general your dad's. Was there anything more specific about how your dad sort of dealt with all of this, Anthony?
My dad, I mean, I'm actually, as it happens, right this afternoon I was reading Frantz Fanon, and I was thinking about how he talks about the role of colonialism in giving people a kind of cultural inferiority complex. But my father came from a traditional elite. I'm named for one of his ancestors, who was a very successful 18th century Asante general, and so he didn't. It sort of seemed crazy to him if anybody looked down at him, because he was used to thinking of himself as being an important member of an important family.
Yes.
So I really don't think it. I mean, it might have annoyed him sometimes. His account of his period in England was that he didn't experience a lot of racism personally while he was living in London, and that he had a lot of good friends. He was the godfather of a white English couple, of course. So we knew them throughout our childhood, and they were ordinary English people. I mean, he worked for the railways, and she ran his house, and they had lodgers. They had people who lived in the house with them. So they were not grand at all, but they were very, very. He was very close to them. So I think I don't think he had bad. He doesn't. Anyway, he didn't tell us about any bad experiences.
Okay.
So I can't say it was. I can't say it felt like a problem when we were children. I mean, the first time I myself sort of was aware of, sort of felt like I had been subjected to a racist attack was just somebody shouting the N-word at me on the street, and I was in my 20s when that happened, and he was a crazy person. I mean, he was literally mentally ill. So it was shocking. I don't mean it wasn't shocking. It was shocking, but it didn't. He had this. This was a person who couldn't do anything to me.
Right.
He had no power or authority. So, and honestly, apart from that, I don't really remember many occasions when I was aware of that.
No, well, thank you for sharing that, Anthony. So you've talked, I want to explore more at some point about the English side of the family. So you come from royalty from Ghana, Asante. So tell me about what was that like, and in terms of, now you said it was your uncle who was the king?
So, well, first my great uncle, these are relatives by marriage. I mean, my father's status as a potential chief was independent of all this, but it just happened that the two kings of Asante before the current one were married to an aunt and a great aunt of mine. So, so they were in-laws of ours, And, quite often after church on Sunday, my mother and my sisters and I would go and sit with the king and have a chat. And I knew my uncle, the one who succeeded my great uncle, very well, because he was the husband of my father's favorite sister, and their children were our closest cousins. So we knew him. I mean, when I was a kid, I would go to his house and he would hold my hand and we'd walk around and chat together. So, again, once he was king, we continued to see him, and we spent a lot of time at not at the palace, but at his private house. So, I mean, at the time it seemed all perfectly normal, because it was just how things were. Yeah. Now, looking back on it, I think, wow, this is very strange to have spent so much time hanging around the palace.
What was the palace like?
Well, it changed. When we were young, the British destroyed the big palace when they conquered Asante. Well, in fact, in one of the wars before that, they destroyed a lot of it. So and they exiled the king of Ashanti. And when they allowed him to come back, and they allowed him to come back, first of all, just as the chief of Kumasi, his capital, not as the king of Ashanti, they built a small place for him. So it was, it's now a museum. I mean, it was a big place by the standards of regular people, but it was for a palace, it was small. And then my uncle, and he was perfectly happy there. But then my uncle, when he became king, had a bigger house built. So the current palace is a modern building built under my uncle, which is, as I say, it's like a very, very big house.
So you had mentioned the relationship between the king, Asante, and Nkrumah,
yes.
prior to Nkrumah coming to power. But what was that like, Anthony?
Well, so one of the centers of resistance to Nkrumah's CPP, the Convention People's Party, that was his political party, was in my hometown. People don't remember this, but until independence, Asante was a separate protectorate. It was governed separate. It was governed through the Gold Coast, but it was a separate thing. So when Ghana became Ghana, it was the union of a bunch of things. The former western part of German Togoland, which voted in a referendum to join Ghana in 1957. And then Asante, and then the so-called northern part of Ghana, the so-called northern territories, all came together for the first time. And Nkrumah, the Asante were used to being the imperial overlords of the whole thing, and the king, and they disagreed. The sort of Asante elite to which my father belonged disagreed with Nkrumah about a number of important policy questions. I mean, Ghana had a lot of money in the bank at independence because it was a successful cocoa economy. And that had been built not by the British and not by, but by Ghanaian entrepreneurs. They had built, Ghanaian farmers had built the cocoa industry starting in the 19th century, starting before the British arrived in Asante. And a lot of the wealth of Asante and a lot of the status in Asante was associated with that. So they didn't like the fact that Nkrumah was going to essentially use the cocoa money to build the country. And he effectively, what he did was he bought, the government had a monopoly of buying cocoa. So they bought all the cocoa. And so they set the price. And of course, they set the price well below the price that the farmers could get on the world market in order to have the difference to develop the country. So the cocoa farmers, who were well connected with the Asante elite, didn't like that. So the first big opposition party to Nkrumah, the United Party, was, which my father joined, having represented Nkrumah in London in the early 50s. When he came home, he decided he didn't like the way Nkrumah was going. So he joined the opposition. And this opposition was sort of based in Asante, and one of the leading figures of it was the chief linguist of the king, a man called Bafwa Akutu. So chief linguist is kind of the spokesperson for the king. It's like being the head of the press office in Washington, I suppose. And he was the guy who on all public occasions spoke for the king. The king would say what he wanted to have said, and then this guy would say it in beautiful, fluent, lovely, old tree, the language. So he was a very highly respected figure, and he was very much involved. So the big opposition to Nkrumah came from this Asante-based elite. Now, the party wanted to be a national party, and they ran all over the country, but it was led and formed by people in Kumasi, and it was seen as an Asante party.
Okay.
And because of the history, of course, the Asantes favored federalism, and Nkrumah favored a strong central government. This is a familiar kind of dispute. So that's what happened. And so while the king never explicitly, it was a republic, and he was a constitutionally recognized chief, the king never officially spoke out against the president. All these people associated with him did, including my father, who was in opposition to the president in parliament. And so as Nkrumah got more dictatorial, which was one of the reasons why my father had been skeptical about him from the beginning, people like my father and Bafo Kota were locked up. And they weren't, they were literally just locked up. They weren't tried or accused of anything. They were just political prisoners.
Yes.
And so that's why my father ended up in prison, and with a lot of his friends. And in fact, Amnesty International was founded in the year that my father was locked up. And the first trip that Amnesty's lawyers took from Britain was to Ghana to look into what was happening to people like my father. And they did help to get my father out of prison eventually.
And what year was that, Anthony?
So 62.
62. Okay.
So
he was in
and that was why
prison
that was why I went to England.
Okay. And he was in prison.
I should say that the president was particularly annoyed about me, because when the Queen made her first post-independence visit as a foreign head of state, she came by my bed because I was, as I said, I was very ill in hospital. She didn't come because I was there. She was just going through the hospital, but my bed was on her path. And so she greeted me, and the Prince Philip, as he was leaving, turned around and said to me, "Do give my regards to your mother." So at that point, Nkrumah recognizes that the Queen and her husband know that they have been talking to the son of a political prisoner who's married to an Englishwoman. And he was very annoyed about that. And my doctor was fired, all sorts of bad things happened. And that was the point at which my mother, and it was covered in the British and the Ghanaian press. And at that point, that was the point at which my mother thought it was safer for me not to be there. Yeah. Which is why I ended up going to England.
Wow. Do you, out of curiosity, Anthony, do you still have any of those newspaper clippings?
I think one of my sisters has the book of newspaper clippings that my parents kept. It was a thing in sort of in political class in England. You kept a clippings book, so which my mother had. My grandparents obviously did that because he was a cabinet minister, and so my parents went on doing that. So somewhere there is a thing with things about it.
Interesting.
And it was if you have grown up in a political family, one thing you know is that you shouldn't believe everything you read in the papers. So I did not say many of the things I was supposed to have said to the Queen. Right. I think I probably just said thank you. Yeah. Or something like that. I was very, very excited. But
you didn't say free my father, free my father.
No, I did not. I did not. It didn't occur to me. Nkrumah, who knew who I was, because as I say, my father and he had been very good friends, so he recognized me at once, and he refused to acknowledge me. He just looked at the ceiling while they were talking to me.
Yeah.
That's all I remember.
Was it Nkrumah was with the Queen at the time?
Yes, he was taking her through the hospital. Wow. So
okay.
So that was why he was so upset, because this happened in front of him.
Yes. Okay. No. Again, thank you for that. And how long was your father in prison for, Anthony?
About a year and a half,
Okay.
which wasn't long by the standards of some people. I mean, the leader of the independence leader of the United Party died in prison. I mean, he wasn't killed, but he was not looked after properly. He was a diabetic and he wasn't looked after properly.
Okay.
So some people died. But my father was in, as I say, Amnesty made a big fuss. Actually, my grandmother came to Ghana and asked to be allowed to visit him in prison and so on, and that produced a whole lot of negative coverage in the British press. So I think in the end, Nkrumah thought it was better to let him out. And so then, for the rest of Nkrumah's time in office, my father was involved in a lot of, he was a lawyer, so he was involved in a lot of cases dealing with people who'd been locked up for political reasons and trying to get them out.
So
in fact, at his funeral, my godfather, who was also a lawyer, said that he thought of my father as the person who invented pro bono legal practice in Ghana.
Wow. So I'm curious, Anthony, how involved was your father with the whole Pan-African movement?
Oh, very.
And then talking about, I know a lot of people came through London, Lumumba, I think Kenyatta,
yes,
Nyeri, I think a lot of folks came through there.
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit about
yes.
that?
No, my parents met because my mother was the secretary of the man who ran an organization called Racial Unity, which was an organization looking after colonial students in London. And my father was president of the West African Students' Union, so naturally they met in the course of business. But WASU was a big independence organization as well.
Okay.
And so it and my father in particular were involved in the organization of the 1945 Manchester Pan-African Congress, which my father attended, and which was attended, as you said, by Kenyatta, Nyerere, and of course by Dr. Du Bois, W.E. Du Bois,
yes,
whom my father met at that
really?
time.
Okay.
So Pan-Africanism was a very big deal for my father, and later on, he did a certain amount of diplomatic work for the Organization of African Unity, which was the predecessor to the African Union. And for example, he helped in the negotiations between the two independence movements in Zimbabwe in the lead up to Zimbabwean independence to try and get Mugabe and Nkrumah to talk to each other.
Okay.
And he was on the decolonization committee for a year in New York at the UN. So he was very much involved in Pan-Africanism as a young person. He was literally helping with the organization of the Manchester Pan-African Congress and going to it, speaking at it. And he was very moved by Pan-Africanism all his life. And as a result of that, we knew, Richard Wright visited us when I was a child, CLR James, and wrote a book called Black Power about Ghana, which includes an unflattering picture of representation of my great uncle, but never mind. And there was CLR James. So people from the diaspora came to us, and other people from the sort of third world movement. So, Nehru's sister, Nan Pandit, who had represented India at the United Nations, visited our house when I was a child. So we did know, my father knew, and I saw as a child, a lot of Afro-Caribbean, African-American, and African Pan-Africanists.
Okay. And during that time, is that one of the moments when your father and Nkrumah sort of became friends?
Well, no, they had been friends. I don't remember how they met, but they knew each other before the Pan-African Congress.
Okay.
But I'm not quite sure. No, I don't really know why that was. I mean, all the independence people operated together until further on. So the split between Nkrumah's party and the United Party happened later than this. So I think, I remember, they knew each other very well. I remember my mother telling me once that she was surprised because my father and Kwame Nkrumah showered together, but that was a thing that, people were used to doing in Ghana.
Yeah.
And so when he was staying in England, they had showers together. I mean, so they were very close at that point. And I think, though my father was accused of various things, I mean, he wasn't tried for anything. Nkrumah knew perfectly well that my father wasn't doing those things. He was, he thought he was involved in planning to depose Nkrumah, and he wanted to depose Nkrumah by having an election, and winning an election. Yeah. So it wasn't. Anyway, so Pan-Africanism was a big deal in our house.
So I'm curious then, Anthony, about, and maybe it's in retrospect, in terms of your father's thought about independence for Ghana, independence for Africa, did he feel that the situation was moving too fast, too slow? What do you recall what he was sort of thinking about how things should progress?
Oh, he was in favor of moving with more than deliberate speed to get the French and the British and the Portuguese out of governing Africa. So he supported the independence movements elsewhere, and of course he was particularly exercised by South Africa, which, despite the formal constitutional situation, namely that it was a dominion like Canada or something, it was basically, from the point of view of Africans, I think it was just a colonial holdover that needed to be replaced with a proper democratic regime. Yeah. So yeah, no, he supported and I don't think he thought it was going too fast. He knew a lot of the people who were involved. He knew Nyerere, he knew Kaunda, he knew Mugabe, he knew Kenyatta, he knew Azikiwe in Nigeria, and so on. And these were the people who took their countries to independence. And
those are all the fathers of independence. Yes.
Yes.
That's fantastic.
In fact,
I'm curious because I'm named after him. Did he ever get a chance to meet Lumumba?
I don't think so, because by the time of Lumumba, remember, my father's in opposition to the Ghanaian government, and Lumumba needs the Ghanaian government support. Ghana provided some of the UN troops in the Congo.
Yes.
And so that was so there wouldn't have been any reason for him to meet Lumumba.
Okay. Thank you for that.
At the time that at that time.
Yeah. In terms of your father's opinions on, the speed of independence of Ghana, did that cause any friction for your mother and the family in England?
No, because they got married in '54. Independence was already on the way. Nkrumah was going to be best man at their wedding, but he couldn't because he'd been made. It was called leader of government business, but it meant prime minister of the Gold Coast. So independence was happening, and so it wasn't. I don't suppose anybody in my family, in my English family, particularly cared about the speed of African independence. But Ghana's independence was underway, and it was a done deal, basically. I mean, there was stuff to be negotiated, but it was a done deal. It was going to happen.
Yes.
So it was too late for that. I mean, there were obviously, my great-grandfather, who was of course not alive at this point, first went to Parliament as a unionist and as someone who was opposed to the separation of Ireland from England. So, which is, Ireland was in a way the first of the British colonies to get independence or to get partial independence. So I don't know what they would have thought. Actually, I think. My great-grandfather was, among other things, involved in. He was one of the guys who led the charge for the League of Nations, and in fact, my great-grandfather was on the Mandates Commission that supervised the former German colonies after 1920 or so under the Mandates.
Interesting.
So he was very much involved as a judge and a lawyer, very much involved in thinking about those things. And I'm sure, by the time independence came, he would have been in favor of it.
You've talked so beautifully about your parents and your grandparents. in terms of, growing up, let's say the mid 60s, do you have any other sort of mentors or champions, Anthony, that role models that you're looking up to who are sort of inspiring you?
Well, I haven't talked much. I mean, about my father's stepmother, Auntie. We called her Auntie Jane. She lived across the street from us with my grandfather, and she was very important in my life. So my English grandmother was important, but so was my Ghanaian grandmother. They were very. I mean, I think, from that kind of background, you get a kind of confidence that comes from being loved by all these wonderful people.
Yeah.
Who are respected members of their communities. And she was a big wheel in the Methodist Church, like my grandfather. And so, yeah, she was very important to me. I don't actually have a lot of, it's interesting, and I since I'm now a teacher, this worries me a bit, but I don't think of any of my teachers as particularly, and maybe there were some who influenced me in ways I can't remember. I remember loving one of my primary school teachers, Mrs. Nyantic, who actually her son married one of my cousins. So I loved her, but in terms of influence, I suppose the big influences on me in my school were my friends with whom I started reading philosophy. There were some teachers involved in organizing the groups, but basically the influence came from each other, I think, more than from the teachers. There were two teachers. One was a chaplain and the other was an atheist, and they competed for the attention of philosophically minded young people.
Yeah.
So I guess, I mean, they were important because they sort of got us reading things. But in terms of the real influence, it was the people in that group, the other boys in that group. It was a boys' school in that group that shaped a lot of my. In dialogue with them, I developed a lot of my ideas in my when I was 14, 15, 16, 17, that sort of age. Those are the big influences. One of them is just retiring actually as a professor of philosophy at Cambridge. One of the people from this group, so he became a philosopher too.
Wow. Well, I know from my experience, certainly growing up, and that's right. I love my parents. I love my grandparents. I always thought they were wonderful, but it took a lot longer, for me to really, really appreciate how amazing they were and the lessons that they taught me, and then having my own children. So when you sort of look back now, Anthony, on what you learned from your mother, your father, your grandparents, can you pinpoint some of those things, Anthony?
Well, I think one thing that I got from my grandmother and my mother and my father was a sense that, not often explicitly articulated, but certainly sometimes explicitly articulated, that we were creatures of great privilege, and that meant we had great obligations, that you couldn't take as much as we had been given from the world without having a duty to give back. And this has affected not me and my sisters, who are all involved in various ways in all kinds of, moving places forward, the places they live. They don't live in Ghana, but or in England, actually. Well, one of them lives in England. But my elder sister lives in Namibia, very involved in development in Southern Africa, moving the countries, not just Namibia, but Mozambique, Botswana forward. My sister, who married a Nigerian, lives in Lagos. He's a public, they're in public figures. He's involved in the political parties, and he was once finance minister of Lagos State, but that's not an elected position, that's an appointed position. So he's not an electoral politician, but he works with politicians to advance various agendas, cleaning up Lagos, that kind of thing. And my sister's very much involved with that too. So I think we were raised with that sense that of civic obligation. And another thing, which is evident in the fact that we're all over the place, is that we were raised to think that your responsibilities didn't stop at the boundaries of the place you happen to be living in. So my grandmother followed things in China and India and obviously in Ghana with a kind of citizen-like interest. Yeah. And my father was obviously a Ghanaian patriot, but he also cared a lot about all the countries of Africa and Pan-Africanism. And he cared about global issues a good deal. He cared about persistence of slavery everywhere, not just in the African continent. Yeah. And so I think we were raised in a public family, as I say. My father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, and actually his great-grandfather were all members of parliaments, different parliaments, Ghanaian parliaments, British parliaments, House of Commons, House of Lords. But so we were a public family in the sense that we felt we were raised to think of ourselves as having public obligations. And that was a very, as I say, it wasn't so much explicitly saying that as the fact that that's what they did. Yeah. And they.
So do you recall that civic responsibility? Do you recall how old you were when it really sunk in that this was something that was important for you to be a part of, Anthony?
It's hard. I don't have a sort of memory of a moment of sort of thinking, that's what this all means. Clearly, I was 8 when my father was put in prison for his country. And my mother explained to us that this was obviously not pleasant, but that he was doing what he believed in and that she believed in him too, and that he'd be out eventually, basically. And so I think.
I mean, would you say you were like a teenager? You were in your 20s?
Oh, certainly by the time I was a teenager, I was very conscious. I mean, so I had to think about, in those years, you're thinking a little bit about what you're going to do. Because I was so ill as a child, I had decided very young to be a doctor. So I was on that track. But if you'd asked me about why, I would have said because doctors can help people. Yeah. And I would have expected probably to be a doctor in Ghana, where doctors were more needed than in England. But I protested the Vietnam War. I mean, I did the normal public-facing things that a late 60s teenager would have done. And I was attacked. I escaped, but I was chased by police in Paris at a union demonstration in 1968. Wow. So I don't mean I did anything very useful for anybody, but I was keeping track of the world and feeling that one had responsibility. And certainly one of your responsibilities, obviously, was some kind of political engagement. Yes.
Yeah. So now, when did your father pass away, Anthony?
In 81. I'm sorry, 91. Sorry.
91. Okay.
Now, he was quite young.
Okay.
He was in his early 70s.
So you mentioned Vietnam. When does, obviously your father is very, very busy with everything that's going on in Ghana and all over Africa, but the civil rights movement, what's happening here in the United States, how much does he pay attention to that? And when do you sort of become interested in what's happening here in America, Anthony?
Well, so in the late 60s, when he was at the UN, my father went to church in Harlem. So he lived in an African-American world from a point of view of his church membership. So he obviously knew a great deal about it, living in the United States as a member of the Ghanaian delegation to the United Nations. And as I say, going to church in Harlem on Sundays. And my parents, I have my parents' copy.
I got to ask, he didn't by chance go to the same church with Adam Clayton Powell, did he?
Yeah, I think he did, yes. Yes.
That's great.
So, I mean, I don't know how he picked that church, but I think that's where he went. And so he was very, we were brought up to admire Dr. King. We had The Fire Next Time. We had the first edition of The Fire Next Time. My parents bought that, and it was in our library when I was, growing up. So yes, we knew about that struggle, and you have to remember that for Pan-Africanism, which is intellectually framed by Du Bois, the issues of dealing with racism in the industrialized world and racism in the colonies were part and parcel of the same thing, so that the civil rights movement was a Pan-Africanist issue. It wasn't just an American issue.
Yes.
And so my father would, and that's how my father thought about it, obviously how Dr. Du Bois thought about it. And it's how I thought about it. I thought, this is our business too. We don't live in America, but the matter of how Black people are treated everywhere is our concern.
Yes.
And so, yeah, so we had, as I said, we had Baldwin, and Wright, because he wrote about our hometown. So we had that book, and we had, we sort of knew about Dr. King. And
so in terms of Dr. King, Anthony, so two things. One, do you recall, now you're living in London, going to school in London in 1968?
Yes, well, in England, not in London, but in England.
England. Do you recall how your father reacted when he heard about Dr. King, and did it have any resonance at all to you as a 14-year-old?
You mean his death?
School in England.
You mean when he died?
Yes.
Yes. Well, everybody, I assume everybody in the world, I would have assumed that everybody in the world knew when Dr. King died, because it was a world historical moment. And certainly, I was moved by it, saddened, deeply saddened by it. I don't think, I'm not sure that it changed my view about, I mean, I had a pretty negative view of American racism growing up. And I guess, I mean, the first assassination I remember actually was President Kennedy's assassination. I remember that. I remember the headmaster of my English school coming into us in morning prayers and saying, "We're going to say prayers for the American president because he's been shot." So I mean, I suppose I thought America is a place where people shoot people, where they shoot political leaders. And given the intensity of the opposition to civil rights, it didn't surprise me that happened, I suppose. I wasn't, I was shocked, but I couldn't say I was surprised, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
And in fact, I mean, it's interesting. So in 76 or 7, round about there, maybe 78, my friend Skip Gates invited me to come for the first time to the United States. He was a beginning assistant professor at Yale, and I was still a graduate student, but he said that he could arrange for me to do some teaching, and I taught a course on Pan-Africanism at Yale, but as a visiting student. But that I took a bit of persuading, frankly, because I didn't like what I thought I knew about race in America. And and in fact, I don't know if I would, I mean, I was, I'm very fond of him. I was glad to see him, so I probably would have come. But the thing that probably changed my mind or made me sure that I should do it was that my mother and my sister visited him in New Haven, because my mother was giving some lectures about African art in UCLA, and she was coming back through the East Coast. And they said, "No, it seems perfectly nice. Nobody shot at us." So I had this rather, Kojak image of American cities. My naivete now strikes me as preposterous, but so I wasn't all that. Anyway, so I definitely didn't have a super positive idea about how black people were treated in America, and it was one of the reasons, as I say, why I might have been reluctant to come in the first place. Though once I came, I found myself very much attracted to what was going on in African American studies, which was really the field that brought me to the United States, rather than philosophy. But
so, and thank you, Anthony. And I've kept you for an hour already, and we've just scratched the surface. But I want to ask you about racism. And you talk about 78. You're thinking about coming to Yale. Again, maybe it's in retrospect, but in looking at race in England and race in America, again, when you look back on it, what were there some sort of profound differences, or not many differences at all, in terms of race relations between blacks and whites?
I mean, there was no history of domestic slavery in England. So black people were never enslaved in England. They were enslaved by England, but in England they weren't enslaved. Mostly, I'm simplifying. The story is a little bit complicated, but as a matter of law, long before American emancipation, you couldn't enslave a person in England of any race. And also, the United States knows that it is a country that was created by people who came from one place and settled in another. The founders were transplanted, largely English families, English and a little bit of French and German and Dutch. And then the African population of the United States was brought here in slavery. So, and they came about the same time. And many of the Africans, of course, came before the ancestors of many of the modern white population of the United States, many of whom came obviously in the 19th century and in the 20th century.
Right.
So the idea that this is a kind of white geography, given that the American Indians were here first, and given that black people came about the same time as white people, just doesn't, I know there are people who think that, I know there are white nationalists in America, but it sort of doesn't make any kind of sense. It's sort of, no historian is going to agree with you. It's sort of crazy. In England, it was white, 99.999%. There are a few Africans may have come to Britain in Roman times and so on with the Roman Empire, but basically the first Africans arrived in England in Elizabethan times and in very small numbers. So that the presence of black people in England, the historical presence is much shorter, and the white people have a deeper sense of their having come out of the ground there, being autochthonous. Now, all this is nonsense. Many modern white Britons their ancestors came at some time in the last 100 years, or the last 50 years, or the last 200 years. I mean, so, but still, it's sort of easy to think of it as a white space in which black people can be welcomed or not, but in which it's up to sort of the white people to decide. So it's much harder. I think it's been harder for English people to realize that they are racist and how racism affects everyday life in England. The thing that I found most liberating in a way about coming to the United States was that, not that it wasn't racist, but that people knew it was racist. And so some of them were trying to do something about it. Whereas in England, a lot of people just, you would complain about something and they just wouldn't see it. And therefore, of course, they weren't trying to do anything about it. Now, that's changed a little bit. Oddly, the Black Lives Matter movement seems to have had an impact in England as well. And so there's more awareness of the ways in which, among white people, of the ways in which England is unfriendly to black and brown people. But when I was growing up, that really wasn't clear. So, you know, when I went to university, there were 3 black people in my college. Skip Gates, me, and a Nigerian called Dapo Ladimeji. And I know his name because there were only 3 of us. and also he was doing philosophy. So,
and this is at Cambridge, Anthony? This
is Clare College, Cambridge.
Right.
Now, you know, Cambridge is going to give me and Skip an honorary degree this summer. They've decided, they've sort of moved on these issues, and they'll be giving one to Wole Soyinka as well. And Skip will be giving a Crummell lecture next week in England in memory of Alexander Crummell, who was the first black person to graduate from Cambridge, and who is the Alexander Crummell, of course, that Du Bois talks about in The Souls of Black Folk. So they've I think there's been a big shift in England. But when I was young, I don't say racism, as I've said, racism really wasn't the big problem for me because of the class issues. But I don't think people in England realized how racist they were. And not just about black people. There was casual anti-Semitism of a sort that you don't see in the United States. American anti-Semitism is not casual. It's intended when they do it.
Yes.
And so on. So the answer is they're very different, and they're different because partly I think because of the sense that this country, our country, America, is, as I say, the natural story of this is that it's Ishmael Reed said this very well once, and now I can't remember the exact words. But anyway, we are a country that the world has given itself. People have come from everywhere. And so there's a sense in which nobody has first, except arguably the indigenous population, the first peoples of the United States, the American Indians, has a sort of natural claim on the territory. We all have the same sort of right to be here. Now, as I know, there's white nationalism now, but I have to say, and it's dangerous. I mean, those people are going to kill some people. And already have killed some people. They killed somebody in Virginia, but they're sort of crazy. I mean, they're out of the natural way of thinking. There's a lot of racism in America, but there's not a lot of people who think that that's the right way to think about what America is anymore, I think. And I don't want to underplay the danger of these people, but they are out of the mainstream by a long way.
Obviously, we've got a long way to go, but I appreciate your insights into everything you've talked about. Thank you so much, Anthony. Can I get a chance to talk to you again at some point?
Oh, absolutely. This was great. I'm sorry that I sometimes ramble on a bit, but you're asking me about things that I know something about and that I find interesting, and that I'm, as I say, grateful for. I'm grateful for having this family that I am proud of, and that I also think has given me some signposts as to how to live.
Yeah, well, no, it's interesting. Again, I'd like to talk more about that too in terms of class, because I know that in our family, and it's very different, but, you know, my mother always talks about, you know, we were upper middle class, well-educated Black family. And that was in a sort of a different class. And there was a certain standing that my grandparents had in the community because of who they were. And now, you know, you're talking about a whole nother level, royalty in essence. But it's interesting, the idea that there were times when you felt shielded from race because of your class. And that's fascinating. And obviously there aren't a lot of people of color who live in, you know, the Western world who can sort of identify with that. So that's really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that one reason why I think it was so easy, in a way, from the point of view of my parents' families, for them to marry, was because they came from confident people. And the confidence came from the fact that they had done something. The people they came from, the men and the women they came from, had done things in their respective societies that were undeniably, you could agree or disagree with what they'd done, but they were undeniably significant. And they were, again, you could disagree or agree, but they were respected people. And that's a very, you know, if I was allowed, if God allowed me to flip my fingers and do one thing, I would say, let's do that for every child. Let's make every child feel that she or he enters the world as an heir to something of importance, and with important things to be doing, and the confidence to proceed that way.
Well, I think that's one of the things I love doing what we're doing, because it really is trying to inspire and empower young people to pursue their dreams. And you know, one of the things we get all the time from teachers say, you know, Adam, it's great that we get, you know, young people need to see successful people who look like them. And, you know, this is what we're trying to do. And then it's also, as we alluded to before, it's also about sharing people's paths, career paths that kids maybe had no clue about. So it's, you know, ambassadors, philosophers, educators, you know, all these different areas that young people are just not exposed to. And it's, you know, the public school system is doing its best, but it's very limited in so many ways. And we're not preparing our young people for achieving their dreams. So again, it's a privilege and an honor to talk to you about your family, and I'm looking forward to talking about your career. And again, Anthony, thank you so very much. This is the Black Experience for all. If you like what you hear at the Black Experience, please consider clicking on the join button to support our nonprofit. I'm Adam P. Kennedy. Thank you for joining us.